offer a voice of reality, having commanded two wars somewhat uniquely, and noting that there will be unintended consequences, there will be innocent lives lost, there will be enormous damage and destruction. The casualties on the Israeli side will be very substantial. It's inevitable.
I saw a headline today about the world holds its breath as we wait to see what Israel does next. Tell us, in your view, the plausibility, the level of risk, the level of danger in a military sense of Israel attempting a land conquest of Gaza for the purpose of eliminating Hamas.
Well, it's entirely plausible. This is a mission that the military can carry out, but the risks are very substantial. The context could not be more challenging. Fighting an enemy, terrorists who don't wear uniforms, who can drop their weapons, will fight from civilian buildings and infrastructure, whose headquarters, bases, and facilities are underneath hospitals, inside mosques, and so forth. Will employ suicide bombers, will have improvised explosive devices. You know, if the defense is as creative as the terrible attack was, there's no question that the challenges of urban warfare, normal challenges, will be further augmented. Keep in mind, it's a densely populated area. They'll do it in bite-sized chunks, if you will, but you're still going to have many hundreds of thousands of people at the very least, depending on how many evacuate from the north in Gaza City. You have high rises, not just modest homes, very tightly packed together. If you really go at this with the mission of destroy, which means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution, you're going to have to clear every building, every floor, every room, every basement, every tunnel. And of course, there's an extensive tunnel system running underneath the populated areas. There will be very substantial damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure and facilities. There will be substantial losses, not just by the Hamas terrorists and the Islamic Jihad terrorists, but also by Israeli soldiers. And of course, the civilians will be caught in the middle of all this, those that remain, that either don't heed the direction to evacuate or just don't have that as an option. So again, the context is about as challenging as one could possibly imagine. We did large urban operations during the wars in Iraq in particular, and also Afghanistan to a degree, and they're very, very tough. The liberation of Mosul from the Islamic State took many, many, many months. It was gone about very painstakingly. And of course, Israel wants to observe essentially the Geneva Convention. Its concept for that is called purity in arms, and to try to minimize the loss of life to innocent civilians and minimize damage to infrastructure. That just is not entirely possible, given this situation. And they should blame Hamas for all of this, because it's that attack that has brought this about at a time when actually Israel, ironically, had been loosening the restrictions on residents of Gaza coming into Israel to work and a variety of other actions. But inevitably, they'll also blame the Israelis.
And how possible is it to limit? I mean, you can say you can be painstaking, you can issue warnings as they have done, but ultimately lots of people in Gaza can't go anywhere. There's nowhere for them to go. This is a very densely populated area, as you say. There's going to be lots of civilians around. Are we looking at then, if they were to have to go in and clear out Gaza of Hamas, what is it? Thousands of people could die? Tens of thousands of people could die who aren't Hamas? What if you're involved in this military planning? Is there an acceptable number? How do you go about thinking of that type of moral weighting?
Well, there is a commitment to fighting in accordance with the laws of land warfare that were established in the wake of World War II and the horrific practices that took place during that war. But if you're shot at, you have every right to return fire. And Hamas will fight from civilian areas. Um, they don't observe the laws of land warfare. They certainly look at the horrific atrocities that they committed, um, a week or so ago on Shabbat, and killed the equivalent of, say, 40,000 Americans, compared with the 3,000 that we lost in the terrible attacks on 9/11. Um, it's inevitable that there is going to be loss of innocent civilian life, that there's going to be damage and destruction of civilian buildings, civilian infrastructure. And this is where you then have to get into, okay, how far are we going to take this? And then also think now about what follows. We learned the hard way that if you don't have thoroughly grounded in realistic assumptions, plans for the post-conflict phase, that you can have a real challenge on your hand, as happened after we reached Baghdad, toppled the regime, and all the bureaucrats left. And we ended up owning it. In fact, that's one of the questions I'm sure that the military, look, these military commanders are very experienced, very professional. I'm sure that they are in dialogue with the prime minister and minister of defense and so forth about how they'll carry this out, how far they have to go, what they need to accomplish. But the problem is, if you don't truly destroy Hamas, as I've described it in the military terminology, you're just mowing the grass again. Maybe you're getting closer to the ground this time, but they will come back. And if this is to deal a much more serious blow to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad than before, then it's going to have to be carried out to a considerable degree. And then who owns it? Do they go after the political wing of Hamas, by the way? Because keep in mind, Hamas is the government. It provides the basic services, social services. It runs all these different government institutions. They're distinct to a degree from the Hamas fighters, the terrorists. But again, who will administer this territory if, in fact, all of this is taken out? And yet, if it's not taken out, it's just going to come back. So what I'm laying out is just this enormous conundrum, this enormous set of challenges, this very, very diabolically difficult, fiendishly difficult context.
I want to sort of pan out to the geopolitical situation, but just on a personal level, David, when you look at that, would the morality trouble you as a senior military figure sending people in? I mean, of course, the cause is just in the sense of the acts of terrorism Hamas perpetrated are so appalling that a response is necessary. I think everyone would concede that point. But when you're having to contemplate this from a military leader perspective, David, you know that going into Gaza, children, women, old people, innocents who are walking around as we're having this conversation now are going to lie in the rubble dead through no fault of their own because they're caught in a crossfire. How much should that influence that Israel will do their best? This idea of doing your best to fight properly. I understand that. But that's their hollow words to families that are going to lose people in this. How do you weigh that in your mind as you're contemplating something like this?
Well, you have a set of, you understand the Geneva Convention. You have rules of engagement. You train on those, and you now apply those. But you understand that in this circumstance, with the enemy that you face, who, by the way, appears to care less about the innocent civilians, has brought this on the innocent civilians of Gaza, that it's going to be very, very difficult. And what you do as a soldier is, at the end of the day, you provide input. You make sure that your government leaders understand what is going to take place. You lay out the worst case, the best case, the most likely case. But then they are going to have to make the decision. And the soldiers then will carry out the mission that they are given. It'll be a task and a purpose. And the task, again, is very likely to destroy Hamas so that they cannot perpetrate such horrific, unspeakable acts on innocent Israeli civilians again. But then you have to think through all of this. And again, this is what the military leadership has a responsibility to do, is to lay this all out for the decision makers, make sure they understand, and recognize that, again, if you take out the entire governing structure, who's going to run the place? I remember actually very early on in the fight to Baghdad, I was the division commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. We took the first large Iraqi city, Najaf, the holiest city in Shia Islam. And I remember calling my boss, several day fight. All of a sudden, the enemy collapsed. We took it over, city of about 400,000 or 500,000 people. And I called him and I said, "Hey, boss, we got good news and bad news. The good news is that we own Najaf." "What's the bad news?" he asked. "We own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it?" And we called the people that were supposed to do the post-conflict stuff, and they were still getting organized. So we ended up administering it for a considerable period of time. That's the prospect here, and you're right to raise those concerns. We should lay this at the feet of Hamas, but recognizing that much of the world may not see it that way.
And on that note, what Israel does will be observed by not only their Western allies, but also other people in the region who are hostile to Israel. How worried are you, David, of this conflagration setting fire to other conflicts, making the conflict broader? The issue of what Iran will do, what will Lebanon do, there's Hezbollah, there's all sorts of agents involved. What's your level of concern about this expanding?
Oh, you have to have very substantial concern about that. We're seeing Hezbollah making trouble on Israel's northern border. You're seeing the possibility of some trouble coming from Syria, perhaps in the form of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps or something along those lines. You have to be concerned about what could happen in the West Bank. And this is why Prime Minister Netanyahu not only needs to tell the world what his forces are going to do, he also needs to provide a vision for what follows. And that should include a vision for the Palestinian people. That gives them some hope for the future. For the people of Gaza, how will they survive? That should be part of the communication strategy once it is resolved. But again, these are exceedingly difficult tasks, very, very tough missions. And there will be a little bit of a temptation to let's see how this goes, and then we'll see what we do. And that's understandable. No plan survives contact with the enemy. But one hopes that there is a recognition of the enormous challenges that lie ahead, the costs that will be incurred in a variety of different ways, and very much so the possibility that there could be wider regional actions, escalation, and so on.
Do you trust Netanyahu? I mean that's the other concern. We speak to a lot of Israelis on our program, and there is deep-seated concern among some about Netanyahu's personal behavior, his personal obsessions, the fact that this was allowed to happen, which looks like a failure of intelligence, maybe a distraction in government. Netanyahu is a very polarizing figure. He's a figure that often acts to save his own political skin. Are you worried that he is the man having to make these calm decisions that have such consequences, such human consequences, such geopolitical consequences? Should we be worried about Netanyahu? Are you worried about him?
Actually, I'm reassured because of the coalition that has come together to support the Israeli government, which is correct, I think. Benny Gantz, a longtime friend of mine, of course, was the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces and the Minister of Defense, has joined the coalition. So I think you have a broad coalition now. All of the voices are going to be heard in this. They're going to engage in collective decision-making. If not, he'll lose his new coalition members. So I think you have a very experienced and professional set of voices that are now part of the conversation around these decisions.
And is there a worst-case scenario where Iran gets involved, America gets involved, and all of a sudden this escalates into something that looks like other forces, proxy wars, that type of scenario?
There are other possibilities. You could see Iranian-supported Shia militia causing problems not just in Gaza. Of course, they're the principal supporters of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, Shia militia in Iraq and Syria. So again, I can assure you that our military leaders, our policymakers here, and our intelligence leaders are keenly aware of all of these different possibilities. And it's one reason why we have 2 entire carrier task forces in that region right now, having had none in there prior to this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. David, can you offer a word of reassurance to people listening from your perspective, or is this going to be bloody and painful? And our hearts can only go out. They went out last Saturday to the murdered victims of terror in Israel. Our hearts will go out to people in Gaza who may not wake up tomorrow.
No, I offer a voice of reality, having commanded 2 wars somewhat uniquely, and noting that there will be unintended consequences, there will be innocent lives lost, there will be enormous damage and destruction. The casualties on the Israeli side will be very substantial. It's inevitable. And people need to be ready for this. But let's come back to why this is taking place. And let's not lose sight of what transpired last weekend in an event that, again, was just truly barbaric. Truly unspeakable acts were carried out against fellow human beings. And the responsibility for this lies at the feet of Hamas.
And just finally, David, do you know why we're still trying to work out? They must have expected a reaction. They must have. Did this get out of hand? I can't see the strategy behind any of this. I mean, maybe there's no strategy behind acts of terror by definition, but it's hard to see what was going to happen other than some form of understandable violent counter-reaction from Israel.
It's impossible to provide any rational reason for what took place. The political leaders outside Gaza will try to say that this is about raising the issue that has been on hold now and no one seems to care about, and so forth. But obviously that's just wholly inadequate and shameful. So we should be prepared, though, that Hamas may have literally sought to provoke and to then force Israel into taking the actions that they are taking, and they do need to take, in the hopes that that can bring about widespread criticism of what it is that they do. And Israel's keenly aware of that. I can assure you that those soldiers and their leaders and their commanders are very, very aware of this.
David, we could talk for hours about this, but unfortunately, there's no time for that. We're ever so grateful for you taking the time to speak to us and give us your, as you say, a unique perspective on what might transpire and what's at stake here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Steve.